They mocked her, right in front of hundreds of people. The groom stood in the middle of the opulent banquet hall, looking at her as if she were an outcast, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that she didn't deserve to be there. She stood there, in her worn coat and tattered leather shoes, not saying a word. And in that moment, no one in the room understood that the 72-year-old woman in cheap clothes was the owner of the companies that the arrogant groom was trying to climb the social ladder by claiming. If you want to know what happens next, subscribe to the channel, comment with the city or country you're watching to let me know how far this story has come, and like this so it reaches more people. Don't go anywhere. The morning of my granddaughter's wedding, I woke up at 5 o'clock the way I always do. Not because I had to. Not because there was anything urgent waiting for me downstairs. I just don't sleep past 5 anymore. Haven't in years. My body made that decision somewhere in my 60s and never reversed it. So I lay there in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the quiet. Then I got up, made a pot of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table the way I do every morning. Just me and the sound of the house settling around me. I should have felt something. Joy, maybe. Anticipation. It was Lillian's wedding day, after all. My only granddaughter, the girl I used to drive to school in the rain because she missed the bus. The girl who once fell asleep on my shoulder during a thunderstorm and told me, half unconscious, that she felt safest when I was close. But sitting in my kitchen that morning, what I mostly felt was a low, careful unease. The kind that doesn't announce itself loudly. It just sits at the bottom of your chest and waits. I'd felt it for months, ever since Lillian started talking about Damien Cross. I put on the coat I've had since 2003, a dark navy wool blend that's worn at both elbows and missing one of the middle buttons. I've been meaning to replace it for years. I haven't, not because I can't afford something better, but because I genuinely don't care. I've never cared much about those things. My late husband, Martin, used to tease me about it. He'd say, Evelyn, you could buy the whole department store, and you still wouldn't update that coat. And I'd tell him that the coat still worked just fine, and that was enough. I wore the coat to the wedding. The venue was called the Ashford Grand, a converted estate about 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of place that charges $20,000 just to walk through the door. Floor-to-ceiling windows, white marble flooring, flowers imported from somewhere I didn't care enough to remember. Everything was immaculate. Everything was expensive. Everything had been chosen to communicate one message to every guest who walked in. We belong here, and you should be impressed. The parking lot alone was a showroom. I counted 3 Maseratis before I even reached the entrance. A young man in a black suit held the door open for me. He gave me one of those long looks, the kind that starts at your shoes and travels slowly upward, doing math the whole time. My worn leather shoes, my old coat, my unremarkable handbag. I saw his expression shift in real time, just slightly, just enough. Are you a guest? He asked. Very politely, very carefully. I'm the grandmother of the bride, I said. He smiled and stepped aside, but I saw him glance at his colleague near the welcome table. A small exchange. Nothing terrible, just a silent conversation that said, keep an eye on that one. I've been on the receiving end of that look for most of my adult life. When you choose not to advertise what you have, people assume you don't have much, and people treat you accordingly. I stopped being bothered by it a long time ago. What bothers me now is how revealing it is. How much a person's character comes through in that single unguarded moment when they think they're looking at someone who doesn't matter. Inside, the reception hall was already crowded. The wedding wasn't for another 2 hours, but the social hour before the ceremony was well underway, which meant 300 people in formal attire were circulating with champagne and performing their best versions of themselves. I found a chair near one of the side columns and sat down. That's another thing I've learned over 72 years. When you want to understand a situation, you stop trying to be in the middle of it. You sit at the edge. You watch. People are almost always more honest when they think no one important is paying attention. Lillian found me about 15 minutes in. She was wearing a dress that must have cost more than most people make in 6 months. Ivory silk, clean lines, beautiful. She looked like something out of a magazine. She also looked, underneath all of that, like she hadn't slept in 3 days. Grammy. She bent down and hugged me. She smelled like expensive perfume that didn't quite suit her. You made it. Of course I made it. She pulled back and looked at me, and I could see her eyes doing the same slow assessment the doorman's had done. She caught herself faster, but I still saw it. Your coat, she said gently. Works fine, I said. She laughed, but it was tight around the edges. Damien's family is here. His mother, his uncles, they're very... She searched for the word. Particular. I imagine they are. Grammy, I just want today to go smoothly. I looked at her for a moment. Where is Damien? Her eyes moved across the room before she could stop them. He's with his groomsmen. He'll come say hello. That's fine, I said. Go be with your guests, Lillian. I'll be right here. She squeezed my hand and moved back into the crowd, and I sat there and kept watching. I'd done my own kind of watching over the past 4 months. Not because I'm a suspicious woman by nature. I'm not. I spent the better part of 5 decades learning to read situations before they became problems. And that skill doesn't turn off just because the situation is personal. When Lillian first brought Damien home for dinner back in December, I noticed things. Small things. The way he talked about his business dealings, always in impressive generalities, never with specific numbers or dates or names. The way he complimented everything about the house and the meal and Lillian's family while saying almost nothing real. The way he checked his phone under the table 3 times during dessert, and each time his jaw tightened for just a second before he smoothed it back out. Lillian's mother, my daughter-in-law Patricia, was completely charmed. Patricia is a kind woman and a terrible judge of character, which is not a combination that serves you well. She talked about Damien for weeks afterward, his success, his ambition, his lovely manners. How lucky Lillian was. My son Robert, Lillian's father, was more cautious, but Robert is also the kind of man who defers to whoever is most confident in the room, and Damien was always the most confident person in any room he entered. That's a skill in itself, not always a good one. I asked Lillian carefully over coffee one afternoon in February what she knew about Damien's business. She lit up. He owned a real estate investment firm, she said. Multiple properties in 3 states. He had clients who were hedge funds, private equity groups. He was, she told me with complete conviction, about to close a deal that would put him in an entirely different financial category. I asked her which firms. She gave me names. I wrote them down on a napkin and put it in my coat pocket. 2 days later, I made some calls. What I found didn't come quickly or cleanly. It never does, when someone has put real effort into building a false front. But I've been in the business world long enough to know how to find the edges of a story that doesn't quite add up. And once you find one edge, you pull gently, and the whole thing starts to unravel. The investment firm Damien supposedly ran had been incorporated 18 months earlier with minimal capitalization. The office address he listed on his business cards was a shared co-working space that cost $200 a month. The clients he mentioned to Lillian were either shell entities or names with no digital footprint that could be independently verified. And the debt. The debt was what stopped me cold. Between personal loans, business credit lines, and what appeared to be money borrowed from people who don't send formal invoices, Damien Cross was somewhere north of $3 million underwater. The expensive suits, the car, the bottle service at the kind of restaurants where you spend $1,000 and leave still hungry. None of it was real. It was all performance. It was all a costume for a role he needed people to believe he was playing. And the play, as far as I could determine, had a very specific final act. Lillian's trust fund, established by her grandfather Martin before he died, administered by our family attorney, set to fully transfer to Lillian on her 28th birthday, which was 14 months away, was worth a little over $4 million. The math wasn't complicated. I didn't tell Lillian right away. I know that might be hard to understand. If you knew someone was being deceived, wouldn't you say something immediately? Wouldn't you sit the person down and lay out everything you found and demand they listen? I've learned, through genuine mistakes, through situations where I moved too fast and lost, that truth delivered too soon, to someone who isn't ready to receive it, often doesn't land the way you intend. Lillian was in love, or what felt to her like love. She'd been with this man for 8 months. She'd planned a wedding. She'd told her friends and her mother and her colleagues. She'd bought the dress. If I walked in with a folder full of documents and said, "Everything you believe about this man is false," the most likely outcome was not Lillian thanking me and calling off the wedding. The most likely outcome was Lillian defending him. And then he would know I was looking. And then whatever chance I had of protecting her would be gone. So I waited. I kept gathering. I watched. And I came to the wedding in my old coat with my worn leather shoes, and I sat near the column, and I let everyone decide for themselves what kind of woman I was. Damien Cross finally came to find me about 40 minutes before the ceremony. He was, objectively, a handsome man. Tall, broad-shouldered, good jaw, the kind of haircut that cost $200 to look like it didn't cost anything. He was wearing a custom suit. I'm not great at designers, but I know fit, and that suit fit him like it had been built around him. He moved through the room the way a certain kind of man learns to move, like every space he entered was already his. He stopped in front of me and looked down. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "I'm so glad you could make it." The warmth in his voice was professional grade, the kind you don't stumble into naturally, the kind you practice. "Damien," I said, "congratulations." He glanced at my coat. I saw it. That same flicker, gone in a half-second. "Is there anything I can get you? Water, perhaps? We have a seating area with some—" "I'm fine where I am," I said. Something shifted in his face, just the smallest compression at the corners of his eyes. People don't like it when you decline their hospitality. It removes one of their tools. "Of course," he said. He smiled again, warmer this time, like he was compensating. "I want you to know how much Lillian talks about you. You're very important to her." "She's important to me," I said. He waited, I think, for me to say something about him. Some acknowledgement of his wonderfulness, his success, his suitability for my granddaughter. The kind of sentence older women are supposed to offer in these situations. "You seem like such a wonderful young man. We're so happy to have you in the family." I didn't say it. He held the smile for exactly 2 more seconds, and then he excused himself. I watched him walk back toward his groomsmen, and I watched the smile drop off his face the moment he was turned away from me, and I thought, there you are. The ceremony was beautiful. I'll give them that. The flowers, the music, the vows. Lillian cried, real tears, the kind you can't manufacture. She meant every word she said. That was the part that hurt the most to watch. She meant it completely. Afterward, during the cocktail hour, I moved around the edges of the room the way I usually do. I talked to a few people I knew. I declined champagne. I ate a small plate of something with truffle oil that cost more than my weekly grocery bill and tasted about the same as a cracker. And I watched Damien work the room. That's the only word for it. He worked it, moving from cluster to cluster, shaking hands, laughing at exactly the right moments, touching people on the shoulder in that way that makes them feel seen. He was masterful. I could recognize the skill even while understanding the purpose behind it. But twice, I caught him stepping away from the main floor and pulling out his phone, and both times his expression while he stared at that screen was not the face of a man at a celebration. It was the face of a man calculating how much time he had left. I took a small notebook from my handbag. I've always carried a small notebook. And I wrote down the time and what I observed. Old habit. Martin used to tease me about that too. When I looked up from the notebook, I found Damien watching me from across the room. He was smiling, but his eyes were not. And then Patricia appeared at my elbow, flushed and happy, holding a glass of champagne. "Evelyn, come sit with us at the family table. Damien's mother has been asking about you." "In a moment," I said. "You can't just sit here by yourself all night. People will think—" She stopped herself. "What will they think, Patricia?" She looked at my coat. She looked at my shoes. She lowered her voice in that particular way people do when they're trying to be kind and aren't quite managing it. "I just want tonight to be perfect. For Lillian." "So do I," I said. I followed her to this family table, and I put my notebook back in my coat pocket, next to the original napkin, now worn soft at the folds, where I'd written down Damien's names 4 months ago. I was ready. I'd been ready for weeks. What I hadn't planned for was how quickly Damien was going to force my hand. The family table was a performance in itself. Damien's mother, Renata Cross, was a woman in her late 60s who had clearly spent considerable effort ensuring she didn't look it. Blonde hair that came from a salon, not nature. A cream-colored dress that was elegant in the way expensive things are elegant, quietly, without trying too hard. She had the bearing of someone who had learned a long time ago that how you carry yourself is the first conversation you have with anyone in a room, and she'd been rehearsing that conversation for decades. She smiled when Patricia introduced me. "Evelyn Hartwell," she said, in the tone people use when they're accessing a file and finding it mostly empty. "Lillian's grandmother, of course." Renata, I said, your son is a handsome young man. She took the compliment the way people like her always take compliments, as confirmation of something they already knew. He's worked very hard to get where he is, she said. We're very proud. I nodded and sat down and let her talk. Renata Cross, I had learned in my months of quiet research, was originally from a small town in Ohio. Her maiden name was Petrocelli. She'd married Gerald Cross, a mid-level car dealership manager, when she was 24, and they'd divorced when Damien was 11. Since then, she had reinvented herself with the kind of focus that, in other circumstances, I might have admired. She now lived in a leased apartment in a good zip code, drove a car she couldn't technically afford, and spent a meaningful percentage of her monthly income on maintaining the image of a woman who had always had money. Her son was her masterpiece. Or he was supposed to be. Damien tells me you've been with the family for many years, she said pleasantly, refilling her wine glass without offering to fill anyone else's. Lillian is my granddaughter, I said. Yes, of course, she smiled again. I only mean, it's lovely that you're so close. Family is everything. She gestured vaguely around the table, where Patricia was chattering at someone from Damien's side, and my son Robert was nodding along to a conversation he clearly wasn't following. This is what it's all about, isn't it? Bringing families together. It depends on the families, I said. She paused, just for a moment. Then she laughed lightly. I suppose you're right about that. I ate my dinner, I watched Renata watching the room. And I noticed, carefully, without making it visible that I was noticing, that every time Damien passed within her line of sight, she tracked him. Not the way a proud mother watches a beloved child, the way a handler watches an asset in the field, alert for problems, ready to intervene. It told me something useful. Whatever Damien was, he hadn't built himself alone. Dinner at a wedding like this is a strange animal. There's the food, which at events like this is technically impressive but emotionally inert, the kind of meal that costs a lot and tastes like effort rather than love. There are the speeches, which at this particular wedding went on about 20 minutes longer than necessary. The best man, a guy named Trevor, who had clearly been drinking since noon, told 3 stories about Damien that were meant to be charming and landed somewhere closer to revealing. The maid of honor cried through most of hers. Lillian laughed at the right moments and held Damien's hand and looked, from across the room, like a woman who had gotten exactly what she wanted. I was watching her eyes. The laughter was real. The love, or what she understood as love, was real. But there was something underneath it that I recognized, the way you recognize a smell from childhood, something you can't quite name, but that your body responds to before your mind catches up. Lillian was monitoring him. Small glances, quick reads of his expression before she committed to her own. She was performing happiness while also constantly checking to see if he was happy with her performance. I had seen that dynamic before. Not in Lillian. In myself, 30 years ago, in a business partnership that eventually cost me 18 months of legal fees and a relationship I valued. The person who makes you feel like you are always one wrong move away from losing them. That person has all the power in the arrangement, and they know it, and they use it. I set down my fork. Robert leaned over from my left. He was on his 3rd glass of wine, which for Robert meant he was feeling expansive and also slightly anxious. She looks happy, he said quietly. She does, I said. Damien seems, he's a lot, but he seems to make her happy. Robert looked. He has his father's eyes, Martin's eyes, and when he's worried, they do the same thing Martin's used to do, a slight narrowing, like he's trying to focus on something just out of range. Mom, what does that mean? It means she looks happy, I said. That's all I said. He held my gaze for a second longer than was comfortable, and then he looked away, back at Lillian and Damien at the head table, and I could see him deciding, the way Robert always decides, to let it go, to trust that what looked fine was fine, to not pursue the thread that might unravel something he didn't want to unravel. That's always been the difference between Robert and me. The trouble started at 9:30. The dancing had been going for about an hour. The older guests had mostly migrated to the edges of the room with their drinks and their conversations, and the younger ones had taken over the floor with the specific energy of people who have been behaving themselves all evening and are finally allowed to stop. The band was good. A seven-piece that played everything from Stevie Wonder to something current that I didn't recognize, but that made the crowd respond like a current had gone through them. I had moved back to my spot near the column. My feet were talking to me. Old shoes, long day, and I was content to watch. Damien was on the dance floor with Lillian, and for a few minutes he looked like what he was supposed to be, a man in love, a man celebrating. He was good at it, the way he held her, the way he smiled at her, the specific performance of intimacy that, if you weren't watching carefully, looked indistinguishable from the real thing. Then his phone vibrated. I saw it from where I was sitting, the way the light hit the screen in his breast pocket just briefly as the fabric shifted. He felt it. I watched his body absorb the information, a almost imperceptible stiffening through his shoulders. And then he leaned in and said something in Lillian's ear, and she nodded, and he stepped off the floor. He went toward the corridor that led to the venue's side entrance, the one that passed near the catering prep area and the staff bathrooms, the kind of corridor people use when they don't want to be observed. I gave him 30 seconds. Then I followed. I want to be clear about something. I am not a dramatic woman. I don't engineer confrontations. I don't follow people down corridors, hoping to overhear something useful because I've seen too many movies. I followed Damien because I had spent 4 months watching this man, and I had learned in that time that the moments when he left a room were the moments when his real life pressed through the surface of the one he'd constructed. And my instincts, which have been refined over 70-some years in more difficult situations than I can quickly count, told me that whatever was happening on that phone was not something I wanted to miss. The corridor was long and poorly lit, the kind of back hallway that exists in every large event venue. All function, no decoration, the world behind the curtain. I moved quietly. Old leather shoes are actually good for that. None of the heel click of something more fashionable. I stopped when I heard his voice. He was around the corner, maybe 20 feet from me, and he wasn't whispering. He was past the point of being careful. I told you, Marcus, I need until Monday. The paperwork isn't... No, listen to me. Listen. The trust transfers in 14 months, and once that happens, I can liquidate the... Yes, I know what I said. I know what I said to the Hendersons, but that was before... A pause. His voice dropped, and I had to concentrate. I cannot come up with that by next Friday. I have $200,000 in liquidity, and that's already... Yes, I understand what the alternative is. I'm not an idiot. Another pause, longer. When he came back, his voice was lower and harder. Then tell them to wait. Tell them the deal is still moving. Buy me 3 weeks. After the honeymoon, I'll have access to the preliminary accounts and I can... Just tell them to wait, Marcus. He hung up. The silence in that corridor felt very large. I stood completely still. My heart was doing something slightly undignified in my chest. Not fear, exactly, but the particular physiological response of having a suspicion confirmed at a higher level of severity than you anticipated. I had known about the debt. I had not known the timeline was this compressed. I had not known he was already making promises against Lillian's trust to people who were, based on his tone when he said the alternative, not the kind of people who waited patiently. He came back around the corner. He stopped. We looked at each other. His face did something complicated and very fast. Surprise, calculation, recovery. He landed on a smile. It was impressive, honestly, the speed of it. Mrs. Hartwell. His voice was easy, slightly warm. I didn't realize anyone else was back here. I was looking for the restroom, I said. It's actually the other direction. He pointed back the way I came, still smiling. Thank you, I said. I didn't move immediately. I let the pause breathe for 2 full seconds, long enough to be uncomfortable, short enough to be deniable. Then I turned and walked back down the corridor. Behind me, I heard him exhale. I didn't sleep that night. The wedding concluded around midnight, Lillian and Damien leaving in a hired car to spend their first night as a married couple at a hotel downtown before flying to Portugal for the honeymoon. I drove myself home. Robert offered to have someone take me, and I declined. I needed the 40 minutes alone. In my kitchen, at the table where I'd started the day, I spread out what I'd accumulated. Not physical documents. I keep those in a fireproof box in my study. But the mental inventory I'd been maintaining for months, now updated with what I'd heard in that corridor. Marcus. That was a name I hadn't encountered yet. I wrote it down. The Hendersons. That rang a distant bell. There was a family by that name connected to a private lending operation that had appeared in some court filings I'd found during my initial research. Not the legitimate kind of lending, the kind that showed up in civil complaints with language about harassment and unreasonable collection practices. 14 months. He'd said 14 months. Lillian's trust transferred in 14 months. And he'd said once I have access to the preliminary accounts, meaning he either didn't understand how the trust was structured or he was planning to petition to access it early, which would require Lillian's cooperation, which meant he needed Lillian compliant and unaware and entirely under the impression that she was in a loving marriage to a financially stable man. I sat there for a long time. The thing about gathering information, real information, not rumor, not impression, is that you reach a point where what you have is enough, where the picture is complete enough that any reasonable person looking at it would understand what they were seeing. I had been cautious about timing because I didn't want to act too soon. But what I'd heard in that corridor moved the calendar. He was running out of time. People with borrowed money and hollow promises always do. And when men like Damien run out of time, they get desperate, and desperate men make choices that hurt everyone around them. I needed to be ready before he was desperate. The next morning, I called an attorney named David Parrish, who has been doing work for me for 11 years, and who is the only lawyer I know who charges his actual rate and doesn't try to double it when he thinks you can afford it. I told him what I had. He was quiet for a longer than usual moment. "Evelyn," he said, "how sure are you about the debt figures?" "Confident, not court certain. I'd say 85% on the headline number, 95% on the fact that something is seriously wrong." The phone call. "I heard what I heard. You can't use that." "I know. I don't need to use it. I need it to tell me how fast to move." Another pause. "How fast do you want to move?" "I want everything documented well enough that when the moment comes, there's no ambiguity. I want it airtight. I want him to have no angle." "That's going to take a few weeks of formal process, maybe more." "Then start today." David started that day. He retained a private investigative firm I'd used before, a small operation run by a former federal accountant named Soo Jin Park, who had the particular combination of skills required to trace financial structures through layers of deliberately confusing corporate paperwork. She was not cheap, and she was not fast, and she was extremely good. I also made a different kind of call. This one to a number I'd had in my personal address book for almost 15 years. Victor Ashford picked up on the second ring, the way he always does. "Evelyn," he said, and I could hear the genuine warmth in it. Victor and I had done considerable business together over the years, and more importantly, we'd navigated a crisis together back in 2011 that had tested both of us and left me with a level of trust in him that I extend to very few people. It was a real estate magnate in the true sense, not a man who called himself one because he'd flipped a few properties, but someone who had built a legitimate empire over 30 years with the kind of disciplined, unglamorous work that doesn't make exciting headlines but produces real wealth. He was also, as it happened, one of the more prominent guests at the wedding the previous evening. He'd been at Damien's side of the room, which I had not mentioned to anyone. "Victor," I said, "what do you know about Damien Cross?" A pause. "More than I should, probably," he said, "and considerably less than he'd like me to." "Tell me." So he did. And what Victor told me, in the particular direct way that he has, filled in the last pieces I'd been missing. Damien Cross had approached Victor's firm 8 months ago, right around the same time he'd started dating Lillian, I noted, with a proposal for a joint venture real estate development in the southwest corridor of the city. He'd had impressive materials, polished presentations, projected returns, references that sounded substantial until you actually called them. Victor's team had done what they always did, which was verify everything. And what they'd found was that the references were either unreachable or, when reached, considerably more cautious about Damien's track record than his own materials suggested. Victor had passed on the deal. He'd been polite about it. He'd thanked Damien for the meeting and said the timing wasn't right for his firm. Standard language for a professional no. But Damien hadn't taken it cleanly. He'd called Victor's office 3 more times in the following month. He'd sent emails that escalated in tone from professional to slightly desperate to, in the final one, mildly threatening, suggesting that Victor was missing a significant opportunity and implying vaguely that his reluctance to partner was motivated by something Victor wouldn't want made public. Victor had kept all of the emails. He was at the wedding, I said. I know, Victor said. I was surprised to see him connected to your family. I didn't realize until last night when Patricia introduced us. And you didn't say anything. It wasn't the time, and I didn't know what you knew or didn't know. A pause. Evelyn, what are you planning? I'm planning to make sure my granddaughter doesn't lose $4 million and 3 years of her life to someone who married her as a financial instrument. Victor was quiet for a moment. What do you need from me? I need those emails, I said, and I need to know that if the moment comes when someone needs to speak to what they know about Damien Cross, that someone will speak. You have both, he said, without hesitation. That's the thing about people who have nothing to hide. They don't need to think about whether to tell the truth. The weeks that followed were their own kind of difficult. Lillian came back from Portugal glowing. That's the word people use, and it's accurate. She had the particular brightness of someone who has been happy in a sustained way and hasn't yet had reason to doubt it. She called me the day after they got home and talked for 40 minutes about the food, the coastal towns, a boat trip they took that she couldn't stop describing. She sounded like the girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during thunderstorms. I let her talk. I asked questions. I did not say what I knew. This is the hardest discipline I have ever maintained, and I want to be honest about that because I think sometimes people imagine that patience comes easily to the people who practice it. It doesn't. Every time I heard Lillian's voice, warm and trusting and completely unaware, something in me wanted to cut through all of it and say, he is going to hurt you. Every conversation where she mentioned something Damien had said or done, I felt the weight of what I was carrying and hadn't yet put down. But I held it. Because I had seen too many times what happens when you hand someone the truth before they're able to hold it. They drop it. And the person who handed it to them becomes the problem instead of the person who deserved to be. Sujin worked fast when the documents started coming in. She was meticulous in the way former federal accountants are meticulous. She didn't make claims she couldn't prove 4 different ways, and what she proved was devastating. The Henderson connection was confirmed, a private loan of $400,000, secured against nothing tangible, with an interest structure that bordered on the predatory and a repayment clause that had already been violated. The shell companies Damien had been using to create the appearance of a legitimate portfolio were traced back to a single registered agent in Nevada who serviced literally hundreds of similar entities for clients who needed to look like they owned things without actually owning them. And then Sujin found something I hadn't expected. There was a previous relationship, a woman named Carolyn Voss, who had been engaged to Damien 3 years ago. The engagement had ended under circumstances that were messy enough to leave digital traces in the right places. A civil complaint, later withdrawn, alleging that Damien had borrowed $70,000 from her during their relationship under false pretenses and had refused to return it. The complaint was withdrawn because Carolyn, under pressure I could only imagine, had agreed to a private settlement. I found Carolyn Voss's contact information through means that are legally gray but not illegal if you know who to ask. I called her. She didn't hang up. She was quiet for a very long moment, and then she said, in a voice that had a specific texture to it, the texture of someone who has practiced being okay for a long time. I wondered if something like this would happen eventually. I'm sorry to call, I said. I know this isn't easy. How old is she? Carolyn asked. Not angrily, just carefully. 27. Does she love him? Very much. Another silence. He's good at that, she finally said. Making you feel like you're the only real thing in his world. Like everyone else is just background and you're the one who sees him, the real him. He has this way of talking about his past, like he's been misunderstood his whole life. And you're the first person who gets it. She stopped. I believed him for 2 years. I know, I said. I'm sorry. What do you need from me? I told her. She agreed without asking what it would cost her. That told me something about the kind of person she was and the kind of damage Damien had done to her. It was during the 3rd week of October, about 6 weeks after the wedding, that Damien made his first visible mistake. Lillian called me on a Tuesday evening, and her voice was different. Not the glowing Portugal voice, quieter, the kind of quiet that means something is being compressed underneath it. Grammy, she said, can I ask you something? Always. Damien mentioned something about the trust, about whether it could be accessed before my 28th birthday. in certain circumstances. He said his attorney thought there might be a provision for married couples in some trusts, that a spouse could petition for early access if there was a documented financial need. She paused. Is that true? I kept my voice steady. That's not how Martin set up your trust, Lillian. Oh, a pause. Okay, because he said it might be worth asking David Parrish about it. He mentioned David by name? He said he'd heard David was the family attorney. He'd apparently looked into it. A longer pause. Grammy, is that normal? For a husband to be interested in how his wife's trust works? The question she was really asking was underneath the one she'd said out loud, and I could hear it, clear as anything, in the slight unevenness of her voice. I wanted to answer the real question. My hand tightened on the phone, but I thought about Carolyn Voss's voice, about how long it had taken her to be believed, about how this exact moment of Lillian's first doubt, was also the most fragile moment. Press too hard and she'd close. Pull back and she'd rationalize. It's worth paying attention to, I said. When a person shows you what they're focused on, that's useful information. Silence. Then, Grammy, the foundation raised funds for children's literacy programs, which is a genuinely good cause, and the annual gala was one of those fixtures on the social calendar that the right kind of people attend partly because they believe in the work and mostly because everyone they know will be there and absence is noticed. Patricia had purchased a table months in advance. She did this every year. It was one of the social commitments she maintained with the kind of low-grade religious devotion that upper-middle-class women of her generation apply to these things. Robert would come and be politely bored. Lillian, in prior years, had usually attended, and I had been going off and on for about 12 years, not because I needed to be seen, but because I knew the foundation's executive director personally and thought the work was worth supporting. This year, Damien and Lillian would be at the table as a married couple for the first time. I had not planned for this to be the moment. I want to be clear about that. I had a different timeline in my head. David Parrish and Sue Jin were still finalizing documentation, Victor was preparing a written statement, and Carolyn Voss had agreed to provide a notarized account of her experience. I estimated we were 3, maybe 4 weeks from having something so airtight that even a sympathetic judge would have no choice. I had intended to present everything privately, first to David, then to Robert, then, most importantly, most carefully, to Lillian herself, in a controlled environment where she would have time to process what she was hearing without an audience. That was the plan. Damien had a different idea. But we arrived at the Whitmore Gala on a Thursday evening in mid-November. The venue was the old Harrington Hotel ballroom, which had been restored about a decade ago, and was now the kind of space that made people feel like they'd stepped into a different era. High ceilings, crystal chandeliers, the particular gold and ivory color palette that communicates old money even when the money is relatively new. The foundation had done the room beautifully. I'll give them that. Patricia had arranged our table near the center of the room, which was exactly where she liked to be. I arrived slightly late. I'd had a call with Sujin that ran long because she'd found something new that morning, and we'd needed to talk through it. And by the time I got there, most of the table was already seated. Lillian saw me first and smiled, and it was the real smile, the one that starts in her eyes before her mouth catches up. She looked tired in a way she was trying to hide under good makeup, but she looked like herself, which was something I was quietly grateful for. Damien saw me half a second after Lillian did, and his expression did the thing it always did. The fast recalibration, the smile snapping into place a beat too slow. He stood up, because men like Damien always stand up when a woman approaches a table, because manners are a costume too. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "you look wonderful." I didn't look wonderful. I was wearing the same dark navy coat I'd worn to the wedding, because the weather had turned cold, and it was the warmest thing I owned that was appropriate for an evening event. Under it, a dark green dress I'd had for 6 years. Sensible shoes. My hair the same way it always is. I looked like a 72-year-old woman who was not trying to impress anyone, which is exactly what I was. "Thank you, Damien," I said, and sat down. The new thing Susan had found that morning was this. Damien had, in the past 2 weeks, attempted to open a joint investment account in both his and Lillian's names at a private wealth management firm called Hargrove Capital. The attempt had been flagged by the firm's compliance team because the projected initial deposit, $500,000, did not match the verifiable assets of either party, and because Damien had listed Lillian's pending trust distribution as a confirmed upcoming asset in the application paperwork, which meant he had already started moving. He wasn't waiting for the trust to transfer. He was trying to borrow against the expectation of it. He was trying to use Lillian's inheritance as collateral for something she didn't know she'd agreed to. I had texted David from the car. He had called back in 4 minutes flat, which for David meant the situation was serious. "This crosses a line," David said. "Listing someone else's assets without their documented consent in a financial application, that's potentially fraudulent misrepresentation. Depending on what he actually told Hargrove Capital, it could be considerably more than that. Can we move on this now? I need 48 hours, maybe 72. Sujin needs to pull the Hargrove documents, and I need to loop in a colleague who specializes in financial fraud. Evelyn, don't do anything yet. We're close. I need the window." I had promised him the window. That was Thursday afternoon. By Thursday evening, at the Whitmore Gala, I was sitting 12 feet from Damien Cross and smiling pleasantly and watching him decide, across the course of the appetizers and the opening remarks and the first round of drinks, that tonight was the night he was going to make his move. I could see it happening. The way you can sometimes see weather changing, not by any single sign, but by the accumulation of small ones that together tell you what's coming. He was drinking faster than usual. He was performing harder than usual, louder, more animated, his stories broader, his laughter sharper. He kept touching Lillian's hand and then not quite looking at her. He was burning energy that he should have been conserving. And he kept glancing at me. Not the casual eye contact of a dinner table, the specific monitoring of a man who has decided that someone in the room represents an obstacle and who is trying to decide how to address that obstacle in a way that resolves his problem permanently. I had seen that look before. In business negotiations that went sideways, in people who had miscalculated and were trying to recover, in men who believed that the best defense was an offense so overwhelming that the other person never recovered. I understood, by the time the main course arrived, what he was going to do. He was going to humiliate me, publicly, thoroughly, finally. He was going to use this room full of people whose opinions mattered to do what he'd been doing in smaller ways since the wedding. Diminish me, categorize me, reduce me to an irrelevant old woman in a bad coat, so that anything I said or did afterward would be colored by that characterization. He was going to make me the problem before I could make him the problem. It was, from a purely tactical standpoint, not a bad idea. It just required him to not know who I was. And Damien Cross, despite everything, had never actually looked at me closely enough to understand what he was dealing with. That was his real mistake. Not the debt, not the fraud, not the manipulation of a woman who loved him. Those were crimes. But the mistake, the one that undid everything, was looking at a 72-year-old woman in a worn coat and deciding she was not worth taking seriously. It happened between the main course and dessert, which is its own kind of detail. The timing of cruelty is rarely random, and Damien chose his moment with the instinct of someone who had done this kind of thing before. The room was at its most socially energized, people were full and comfortable, and the wine had been flowing for 2 hours. The ambient noise level had risen to the point where a conversation at one table would carry to the adjacent tables, but not much beyond, which meant Damien's audience was managed, large enough to matter, contained enough to control. He started gently. That's how it always starts. "Patricia," he said pleasantly, breaking into a lull in the table conversation. "I've been meaning to ask, is there a reason Evelyn always wears the same coat to everything?" It landed with a small, awkward beat. Patricia made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a protest. Robert looked up from his wine glass. Lillian went still in the particular way she had when something made her uncomfortable, and she didn't know how to address it yet. I looked at Damien. I said nothing. He continued, still pleasant, still smiling, addressing the table but angled outward slightly. The practiced posture of someone speaking for a larger audience. "I'm just asking because we have guests here, and I want to make sure everyone understands that the Hartwell family has," he paused, a beat too long, "more diverse circumstances than they might appear." "Damien," Lillian's voice was low and tight. "I'm not trying to embarrass anyone," he said quickly, raising his hands in the gesture of innocent clarification. "I'm just saying it can sometimes create a confusing impression, you know? when someone shows up to these events looking like they wandered in from somewhere else. He smiled, warm and charming and utterly remorseless. Evelyn, I say this with real affection. Do you need anything? I'm happy to help. Family helps family. The table had gone very quiet. The tables nearest to us had also gradually oriented toward the conversation. That social animal instinct that draws people toward tension the way water moves toward the lowest point. I felt something happen in my chest. Not hurt. I want to be precise about this, because hurt would imply that he'd found something vulnerable, and he hadn't. What I felt was colder and more useful than hurt. It was the particular clarity that comes when something you've been anticipating finally arrives, and you understand that the moment you've been preparing for is now. I appreciate your concern, I said. My voice came out steady, which I was grateful for. The coat is fine. He leaned back in his chair, spreading his hands. Of course it is. Of course. He looked around the table, then at the adjacent tables, performing magnanimity. I just think, in a room like this, surrounded by people who've worked very hard to achieve what they have, he let the implication settle. It's worth considering how we represent ourselves, how we represent the family. Damien, Robert's time, more firmly. That's enough. I'm not attacking anyone, Robert. I'm making an observation. It's a disrespectful observation. Is it disrespectful to notice things? He was still smiling. I've noticed quite a few things since joining this family, about how things work, about who makes decisions. The smile acquired an edge. About how much weight certain people's opinions actually carry. He was looking at me when he said it, and that was the moment when Victor Ashford stood up. I should explain Victor's position in the room. He was seated 3 tables away, not at our table, because he had his own foundation commitments and his own seating arrangements, but close enough that he had been, I realized later, watching our table for some portion of the evening. Victor is not the kind of man who explains himself after the fact, but I believe he had come tonight knowing, or strongly suspecting, that something was going to happen. He had his own history with Damien Cross. He had made his own promise to me. And Victor Ashford, whatever else he is a man who keeps his promises. He stood up from his table. And when Victor Ashford stands up in a room, people notice, because he has the particular physical and social mass of someone who has occupied consequential spaces for a long time and knows how to use a room. He was wearing a dark suit, nothing flashy, but he wore it the way men wear things when they don't need the clothes to do the work. He said, in a voice that carried without being raised, "I'm sorry to interrupt." The room shifted. Conversations at nearby tables paused. The ambient noise lowered by several degrees, the way it does when someone with genuine authority speaks into a space. Damien turned. His expression flickered. He recognized Victor, I could see it, and something moved through his face that he couldn't quite control. A rapid assessment. A recalculation. "Victor Ashford," Victor said, addressing not just our table but the surrounding ones, because he understood that this moment required witnesses. For anyone who doesn't know me, I've been coming to the Whitmore Gala for about 15 years. He paused. I couldn't help overhearing the conversation at this table, and I want to say something if I may. He looked at Damien, not aggressively, not with heat, with the particular steady attention of a man who is about to say something true and doesn't need to raise his voice to say it. The woman you're speaking to, Victor said, is Evelyn Hartwell. He let that sit for a moment. Some people in this room may know that name and some may not, which is entirely by her choice. Evelyn has been one of the most significant private investors in this region for over 30 years. She built her first investment network in 1987, when women in this industry were routinely ignored or redirected to smaller opportunities. She did it anyway. She grew it. She divested most of her public-facing positions in 2004 because she valued her privacy more than her profile, which is a choice I have always respected. He paused. She is also, in the interest of full disclosure, the beneficial owner of the Hartwell Capital Group, which holds significant positions in 3 of the companies that Damien Cross has represented to various parties as being within his own portfolio. The silence in the room was total. I watched Damien's face. I have replayed that moment many times since, and what I remember most is not the fear that eventually settled into his expression, but the instant before it, the brief flash of raw, unprocessed shock. The look of a man who has been playing a game and has just realized that the other player had a completely different set of cards than he thought. I don't know the nature of your personal arrangements with this family, Victor continued, still addressing Damien, still measured, still even. But I think it's worth clarifying that the woman you've chosen to question in front of this room about her coat is not the person in this situation who needs to worry about appearances. He sat back down. The room remained silent for approximately 3 full seconds, and then it did not. What follows is the part that I find most difficult to describe cleanly, because it happened in layers and out of sequence, the way real things do rather than the way stories usually tell them. Damien recovered fast. I'll give him that. He had spent years recovering fast, recalibrating on the fly, turning situations around through the sheer force of his confidence. He looked around the room with something close to amusement, performed amusement, the expression of a man saying, "This is a misunderstanding. Let me clear it up." And he said, "Victor, I appreciate the history lesson, but I'm not sure what you think you're clarifying." "I think I'm clarifying," Victor said from his table, without standing again, "that you've spent the last 6 months telling people in this city that you have business relationships and asset holdings that you don't actually have, including, I understand, to financial institutions making lending decisions based on that information." The color drained from Damien's face. Not all at once. In a slow, visible wave, the way it happens when something real hits someone who has been operating on performance for so long that the performance and the reality have become difficult even for them to distinguish. "That's—" He stopped. "I have the emails," Victor said simply. "The ones you sent my office. I've retained them." Lillian was looking at her husband. She had gone very still. The stillness of someone who is hearing something and trying to decide whether to run from it or toward it, and who cannot yet move in either direction. "Damien," her voice was almost inaudible. "What is he talking about?" "Lillian, this is—" He reached for her hand. She didn't move away, but she also didn't take it. That was when I opened my handbag. I want to be very clear about what I brought. I had not come to the gala planning to do this tonight, but I had, for 6 weeks, carried a particular envelope with me to every event, the way you carry an umbrella when the forecast is uncertain. The envelope contained copies, not originals copies, of the most central document Sujin had compiled. The Hargrove Capital application, the Henderson loan agreement, the corporate registry documents showing the shell company structure, and Carolyn Voss's notarized account, 3 pages, in her own words. I did not make a production of placing it on the table. I simply set it there in front of Lillian and said, "I've been trying to find the right moment to show you this. I'm sorry that the right moment turned out to be this one." Lillian looked at the envelope. She looked at me. She looked at Damien. "What is that?" she said. "It's documentation," I said, "of some things you deserve to know about the man you married. I found most of it in the weeks before the wedding. I've been adding to it since." "Before the—" She stopped. Something moved through her face. "You knew before the wedding?" "I knew enough to be very worried," I said. "I didn't know how to tell you in a way you'd be able to hear." "Grammy?" Her voice broke slightly on the second syllable. Not in anger, in something rawer than that. Damien made his move. He stood up from the table, and he pointed at me, and the charm was completely gone, stripped off by the moment the way a storm strips leaves. And what was underneath was not ugly exactly, but it was bare and it was cold, and it was the true shape of him. "This is what she does," he said. To Lillian, to the table, to the room, to whoever would listen. "This is exactly what she's been doing since the day I met her, undermining me. She has never accepted me. She has never given me a fair chance. And everything she's put in that envelope is a fabrication designed to—" "The Hargrove Capital application isn't a fabrication," I said. My voice was even. "You listed Lillian's trust as a confirmed asset in a joint investment account application 2 weeks ago. She doesn't know about that account. She didn't authorize that application. That's a matter of record at Hargrove's compliance department." Silence. Lillian turned to look at him. "Is that true?" she said. He opened his mouth, closed it. The timing was too long. Even 1 second of hesitation, in that room, in that moment, was too long. "I was trying to set something up for us," he said, "for our future. I was going to tell you when it was further along. You listed my inheritance as an asset in an account I didn't know about. Lillian, answer what I asked you." He looked at her, and I watched him make a calculation in real time. I watched him weigh the options, measure the room, assess what was recoverable and what wasn't. He was still trying to find the angle. Even now, even here. "I was handling our finances," he said. "That's what a husband does." The words landed badly. I could see it on the faces around us. Not just at our table, but at the ones nearby, where people were no longer pretending not to listen. Something shifted in the room. The specific shift that happens when a man says something that reveals, without intending to, exactly how he thinks of a woman he claims to love. Patricia made a small sound. Robert set down his wine glass. Lillian picked up the envelope. She didn't open it. She held it in both hands and looked at Damien, and I could see very clearly the moment when the last piece of something gave way inside her. It didn't look dramatic. It looked quiet. It looked like a door closing from the inside. "Damien," she said, "I need you to leave." "Lillian, this isn't—" "I need you to leave this table," she said. "Right now. Tonight." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at me. And the look he gave me was not the look of a man who had lost. Not yet. He hadn't processed the full weight of what was sitting in that envelope, hadn't accounted for David Parrish and Soo Jin and Victor's emails and Carolyn Voss's notarized statement. He was still, somewhere underneath the shock, calculating. But there was something else in it too, something I hadn't expected. Recognition. The specific, delayed, devastating recognition of a man who has just understood that he has been, for the past 6 months, not the predator in the room. He pushed back his chair. He picked up his jacket. And he walked out of the ballroom the way men like him leave rooms when they have no choice. Straight spine, fast pace, chin up, performing dignity he no longer had the right to claim. The room watched him go. What came after was not clean. I want to say that again because I think it's important. Nothing about what followed was clean or simple or emotionally resolved in any satisfying way. There was no moment where the room burst into applause. There was no speech where I said wise things and everyone nodded. There was only my granddaughter sitting at a table in a hotel ballroom, holding an envelope full of evidence that the man she'd married was a stranger, and the specific terrible silence of a family that doesn't know what to do with the truth it wasn't ready to receive. Patricia cried. Not dramatically, quietly, into a napkin, the way people cry when they're crying for several reasons at once, and none of them are simple. Robert sat very still with his hands flat on the table and looked at nothing. Lillian didn't cry. She opened the envelope eventually and read, and her face did things I don't have adequate words for. Not because I couldn't find the words, but because some expressions aren't made for description. They exist only in the moment they happen, and trying to translate them into language is a way of making them smaller than they are. At some point, Victor came to this table. He didn't say much. He set his card in front of me and said, "Whatever you need, Evelyn," and I nodded. He spoke briefly to Robert, something I didn't catch. Then he left us to it, which was exactly the right thing to do. People at nearby tables gradually looked away, returned to their own conversations, the way crowds always eventually do. The moment passes, the curtain comes back down, everyone returns to their own story. Someone from the foundation staff came by to check on us. Patricia waved them off. Lillian read every page in that envelope. It took her a long time. When she was done, she set it face down on the table and folded her hands on top of it, and she sat there looking at the tablecloth for what felt like several minutes but was probably 30 seconds. Then she said, to no one in particular, "How much does he owe?" "The documented debt is somewhere between 3 and 4 million, I said. "There may be more that we haven't found yet." She absorbed that. "And he married me to get to the trust." "That was his plan, yes. I believe there were other motivations as well, but the financial access was the primary objective from the beginning." She was quiet again. "You knew before the wedding," she said. Not accusatory, just establishing the fact. "I knew enough to be very worried," I said again. "I didn't know how to tell you without losing you." She looked at me then. Her eyes were dry and very steady, and something in them was different from anything I'd seen there before. Older, maybe. The specific aging that happens in a single moment rather than over years. "You should have told me," she said. "I know," I said. "I'm I'm sorry. Neither of us said anything for a while after that. The band, which had been thoughtfully quiet during the last 20 minutes, started up again somewhere across the room, something slow and slightly melancholy, as if they'd read the moment. Patricia had stopped crying. Robert had finally picked up his wine glass again, though he didn't drink from it. And I sat there in my old coat, at a table in a ballroom full of people who had just watched a marriage unravel in real time, and I held the very particular feeling of having done the right thing in the wrong way, or the wrong thing at the right time, or some combination of both that I couldn't yet properly sort out. That's the thing no one tells you about protecting the people you love. It doesn't feel like victory, even when it works, even when you've gathered the right information and waited the right amount of time, and the truth finally surfaces in a room full of witnesses. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like standing in the place where something broke, holding the pieces, trying to work out whether there's a version of this that becomes something whole again. Outside, somewhere, Damian Cross was in a car or on a phone or staring at a ceiling, doing his own version of that calculation. And I knew, with the same bone-level certainty that had driven me through 6 months of patience and documentation and difficult phone calls, that we were not done with him yet. The scene in the ballroom had been the exposure. What came next would be something different. What came next would be the reckoning. He called it 2:07 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was still awake, sitting at my kitchen table the way I'd been sitting the night of the wedding, the night this whole thing started, except now the table had more papers on it, and the coffee in my cup had gone cold an hour ago, and I was too tired to get up and make more. I'd driven Lillian home. She hadn't wanted to go back to the apartment she shared with Damian, which I understood completely, and she was upstairs in the room that had been hers growing up, in my house, the room with the blue curtains she'd picked out when she was 9 years old. She'd gone up without saying much. I'd stood at the bottom of the stairs and listened to the sounds of the house settling around me and tried to calculate what the next 72 hours needed to look like. And then my phone buzzed against the table and the screen said Damian, and I looked at it for 2 full rings before I picked up. Mrs. Hartwell. His voice was different, not the polished warmth he used in public, not the cold edge he'd shown at the gala when the performance finally dropped. What I heard now was something rawer than either of those. The voice of a man who had spent 3 or 4 hours pacing whatever room he was in and had run out of other options. Damian, I said, I need to explain some things. It's 2 in the morning. I know what time it is. A pause. I could hear him breathing, slightly uneven, the rhythm of someone who is not entirely in control of their own nervous system. I know how tonight looked. I know what was in that envelope. But there are things you don't understand about my situation that I understand your situation quite well, I said. Silence. I've been in financial difficulty, he said. He said it the way people say things when they're testing how much they have to admit, offering one piece to see what it costs them before they offer the next. The market has been difficult for the kind of work I do, and I made some decisions that, Damian, I kept my voice even. I know about the Henderson loan. I know about Marcus. I know about the Hargrove Capital application. I know about Carolyn Voss. I know about the shell company structure you've been using to create the appearance of a business portfolio that doesn't exist. A pause. I've known about most of this since before the wedding. The silence this time was longer. You knew before the wedding, he said slowly. Yes. And you didn't... He stopped. I could hear him recalibrating, processing what it meant that I had sat across from him for 6 months, attended the ceremony, watched him work every room, and said nothing. Why didn't you stop it? It was a genuine question. Underneath everything else, it was real, and I thought about how to answer it honestly. Because stopping the wedding wasn't enough, I said. Stopping the wedding would have protected Lillian temporarily, but you would have found another way, another approach, another target. I paused. I needed everything documented. I needed it airtight, and I needed Lillian to see it herself, clearly enough that she couldn't rationalize it away. That takes longer than a phone call 3 days before a ceremony. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the tone had shifted, away from the testing how much I have to admit mode into something I hadn't heard from him before, something flatter and more tired. I do love her, he said. I know you don't believe that. I believe you feel something for her, I said carefully. I don't think that feeling is what you've been telling yourself it is. and I don't think it changes what you've done. I was going to fix it. Before the trust transferred, I was going to... With whose money, Damien? He didn't answer. The Hendersons are not patient people, I said. The timeline you were working with had already collapsed. You were 3 weeks from a situation where people who don't send formal invoices were going to start looking for you, and the only asset you had access to was the woman sleeping upstairs in my house, who believed you loved her without conditions. Another silence. Longer. What happens now? He finally said. That depends on what you do in the next 48 hours, I said. David Parrish will be contacting you through your attorney in the morning. I'd strongly suggest you have one. I ended the call. I sat there for another few minutes with my phone face down on the table. Then I got up and poured the cold coffee down the sink and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark yard and the bare November trees, and I allowed myself, briefly, to feel how tired I was. Not just from tonight, from 6 months of carrying something heavy and alone, of smiling at family dinners while knowing what I knew, of watching Lillian look at a man the way you look at someone you trust completely. 72 years, and I still hadn't learned how to make the right thing feel like anything other than hard work with uneven returns. I went upstairs. I did not sleep for a long time. David Parrish called at 7:45 the next morning. I was on my second cup of coffee, real coffee this time, and Lillian was still asleep. I could tell by the silence from the upstairs hallway the specific quality of quiet that means someone is still unconscious rather than simply still. He called me at 6, David said. He doesn't have his own attorney yet, which is its own problem, but he called me directly, which tells you how panicked he is. What did he say? He wants to negotiate. He's using the word cooperate, which means he thinks there's a version of this where he gives us something and we give him something in return. What does he think he has to offer? David paused. He says there are other investors, people who put money into his operation under false pretenses, people who may not yet know the full extent of what he's done. He's offering to provide documentation on those transactions in exchange for reduced exposure on his own charges. I thought about that. Is the documentation real? Sujin is checking now. If it's real, it could be useful to the DA's office. It would also implicate at least 2 other parties who've been running similar structures, based on what Damien described. That's not small. No, David said. It isn't. But Evelyn, I need to be direct with you. If we hand this to the DA and Damien cooperates, the charges he faces could be significantly reduced. You may not get the outcome that feels proportionate. I was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, a squirrel was doing something complicated with a pine cone on the fence rail. I watched it for a second. What I want, I said, is for my granddaughter's trust to be protected, for the Henderson people to have no access to anyone in this family, and for Damien Cross to be in a position where he cannot do this to another person. If cooperation gets us closer to that than prosecution does, I'm not opposed to cooperation. That's a generous position. It's a practical position, I said. I've never confused generosity with practicality. They occasionally overlap. David allowed himself a small sound that might have been a laugh. I'll set up a meeting for this afternoon. Sujin, myself, and the DA's contact I mentioned. Damien's going to need representation by then, or the DA won't engage. He'll have representation by then, I said. He's panicked, not stupid. I was right about that. By 11 that morning, Damien had retained an attorney named Gerald Fitch, who I later learned had a reputation for negotiating white-collar cases with the particular skill of someone who specialized in making the arithmetic of prosecution versus cooperation very clear to everyone involved. He was not, from what I could gather, a man who wasted time on positions that couldn't be held. The meeting happened at 4 o'clock in David's office, which I attended and Lillian did not. She didn't ask to come. She was sitting in my living room when I left, with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, staring at something in the middle distance that wasn't in the room with her. I touched her shoulder on my way out. She put her hand over mine briefly, and then let go. What? I will not detail the full legal mechanics of what followed, partly because the specific procedural details are less important than what they meant, and partly because some of it is still, even now, in protected record. What I can tell you is the shape of it. Damien Cross, represented by Gerald Fitch, entered into a cooperation agreement with the district attorney's office that involved his full documented disclosure of the fraudulent investment scheme he had been operating, including the names of two other individuals who had been running related operations under the shelter of the same network of shell companies. The disclosure was real. Sujin confirmed it within 24 hours, and the DA's office independently verified the core elements within 72. In exchange, the charges against Damien were structured in a way that reduced his maximum exposure. He would still face consequences, real ones, the kind that follow a person. But the ceiling came down from where it might have been if he'd fought. I did not feel good about that part. I want to be honest. There is a version of justice that would have been more satisfying, a cleaner accounting, a more complete penalty. The version we got was messier and more partial, the way most real outcomes are when you're operating through institutions that have to balance competing priorities against each other. But the Henderson creditors were notified through the DA's office, and their own connection to the broader case became a legal problem for them rather than for anyone in my family. That piece mattered. Lillian's trust was protected, not because of anything heroic, but because David Parrish had already, quietly, added a legal instrument to the trust governing documents in the 10 days between the gala and the formal legal proceedings, which ensured that any petition for early access would require documented approval from 3 independent trustees rather than 1. It was a small bureaucratic adjustment. It was also the thing that removed Damien's remaining leverage entirely. When Gerald Fitch conveyed that information to his client, I was told that Damien's response was a long silence followed by a single word. I don't know what the word was. I didn't ask. The divorce proceedings were, in their own way, a different kind of battle. Lillian had retained her own attorney, a woman named Petra Eng, who had a reputation for being methodical and unsentimental, which was exactly what the situation required. The marriage had been brief enough, and the financial fraud documented enough, that the core legal process was not especially complicated. What was complicated was everything underneath the legal process. The human part. The part that no attorney can file paperwork on. Lillian came to my house most evenings during those weeks. Not every night. She was trying, I think, to maintain some architecture of normal life, to go to work and see her friends, and not become someone who only existed in the context of this particular disaster. But most evenings she would come over and we would sit in the kitchen the way we used to when she was a teenager and things at home were difficult. And she would drink tea and I would drink coffee, and we would talk, or not talk, depending on what she needed. Some nights she needed to talk about Damien. Not to mourn him exactly. I didn't observe much of what I'd call grief for the person she'd thought he was, though I suspect some of that happened privately, at a time and in a form I wasn't privy to. What she needed to do those evenings was work through the architecture of the deception. How had he done it? What she had missed? Where the tells had been that she'd dismissed or rationalized or simply not known to look for. One evening in December she came in and sat down at the table, and before I'd even put the kettle on, she said, "I keep going back to the first dinner, when I brought him to meet you." "I remember," I said. "You were very quiet that night. You asked him questions, but not personal questions. More like you were trying to get him to talk about specifics, business specifics." She wrapped her hands around the mug I put in front of her. "I thought you were just being protective. I thought you were like doing the grandmother version of interrogating a boyfriend." "I was," I said. "In a way. But you were actually listening to the answers. You were checking whether the details held up." "Yes." She was quiet. "And they didn't." "Not entirely, not in the ways that mattered." She turned the mug in her hands. "Why didn't you say something then?" "Not everything. I understand why you waited for more evidence. But even just telling me to be careful, to look closer." I sat down across from her. This was a question I'd been asking myself since the wedding, in the quiet hours, and I'd turned it over enough times to have an answer I believed. "Because you were happy," I said. "You were happy in a way I hadn't seen you be in a long time. And I was afraid that if I said be careful, look closer, and it turned out I was wrong, you would look back at me with that specific disappointment that children save for parents who underestimated them. That look that says, 'You didn't trust me to know my own heart.'" I paused. "And I was also afraid that if I was right, saying it too soon would push you toward him instead of away." She looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were steady, but something in them was doing work. "Were you wrong to wait?" she said. It wasn't an accusation. She was genuinely asking. "I don't know," I said. "I've thought about it a great deal, and I still don't know. I think the information I had in December wouldn't have been enough. I think I needed more before I had something you couldn't dismiss, but I stopped. But I also think I was protecting myself a little from being the grandmother who ruins things, from being the person who loved you and had to watch you be angry at me for doing it. I looked at my coffee cup. I'm not entirely proud of that part. She was quiet for a few seconds. Then she said, "That's the most human thing you've ever admitted to me." "I'm full of them," I said. "I just don't usually lead with them." Something shifted between us at that table. Not dramatically. Not in a way that resolved everything or healed everything or put anything back the way it was before. But something softened and became more honest, and that felt, in its quiet way, like progress. Renata Cross called Patricia in mid-December. I heard about this from Robert, who heard about it from Patricia, who had clearly needed to process the call by telling someone, and Robert was available. Renata had called, apparently, to express that she felt the family had behaved unfairly toward her son, that the situation had been mischaracterized, that Damien had been under tremendous professional pressure that explained, if not excused, some of his decisions, and that a woman in my position, this part apparently came toward the end of the call, after Renata had run through her other arguments and found them inadequate, should understand that destroying a young man's life over a financial dispute was not something a person of genuine character would do. Patricia had not handled this particularly well, which I understood. Patricia is a kind woman who does not enjoy conflict and who tends to capitulate under social pressure before regrouping later with a better response. She told me, when Robert relayed the story, that she felt terrible about how the call had gone. "What did you say?" I asked her, when we spoke directly. I think I said that I understood it was hard for her, and then I think I said something about not being able to talk about it. Patricia looked like she was still processing something. And then she said that at least she'd tried to raise Damien to understand what real family loyalty meant. And I should have said something, and I didn't. I looked at her for a moment. Patricia is not a bad person. She is a person who never quite developed the specific muscles required for that kind of confrontation. And you don't grow those muscles after 60 by wishing for them. "It's all right, Patricia," I said. "It's not, really." She had the expression of someone who has failed a test they care about. She was trying to make me feel responsible, and it almost worked. "Almost is enough," I said. She said, Patricia stopped. She said that you had been trying to control Lillian her whole life, that this was about you, not about protecting Lillian, that you couldn't stand someone else having influence over a member of your family. I let that sit for a moment. Renata Cross was not without insight, even at her worst. The accusation contained enough truth to have teeth. The question of where protection ends and control begins is one I have never entirely resolved about myself, and I didn't intend to start pretending otherwise now. "There may be something in that," I said. Patricia blinked. "You don't really believe—" "I believe my motives were not perfectly pure," I said. "I believe I also genuinely love Lillian and that what I did protected her from something real. Both of those things can be true at the same time." I paused. What Renata is doing is trying to find the version of events that makes her son the victim. That's understandable. It's also wrong. Patricia nodded slowly. Then she said something that surprised me. "I should have paid more attention," she said. "Before the wedding, I was so charmed by him. I wanted so badly for Lillian to be settled and happy that I didn't ask the questions you asked. I didn't look the way you looked." She met my eyes. "I let my daughter walk into something because I wanted too much for it to be what it looked like. I didn't say yes, you did, because it was true. And she already knew it. And making someone feel worse about a thing they can't change is not usefulness, it's punishment. What I said was, you love her. That's the starting point. Everything else is just what we learn from it." She nodded. We sat with that for a moment, the two of us, in the particular uncomfortable way of people who have not always understood each other well, and are finding, late, some small piece of common ground. The formal legal resolution came in January. Damien Cross pleaded to 2 counts of financial fraud and 1 count of fraudulent misrepresentation in a financial instrument, the last being the Hargrove Capital application. The cooperation agreement reduced his sentencing exposure, but he still received 18 months of supervised release and a restitution order that required him to repay. Over time, the amounts owed to the Henderson creditors and two private individuals who had been defrauded in the earlier stages of his scheme. The two associates implicated by his cooperation faced separate proceedings. The civil component, the petition Gerald Fitch filed on Damien's behalf, attempting to claim a portion of marital assets, was dismissed. There were no marital assets to speak of, beyond what Lillian had brought into the marriage, and the fraud findings effectively eliminated any equitable claim he might otherwise have had. The shell companies dissolved. The co-working space office address reverted to someone else. The business cards, the presentations, the projected returns, all of it collapsed like a stage set when the production closes, revealing the bare wall behind the painted scenery. The luxury car he'd been driving was a lease that lapsed. The watch that had probably cost more than my first apartment was repossessed by a creditor I hadn't even identified in my research. His apartment lease, co-signed by an entity that turned out to be one of his own shell companies, was terminated. Within 60 days of the gala at the Harrington Hotel, Damien Cross had no address I could find, no functional business, no assets that weren't already claimed by people he owed, and, as far as I could determine, no clear plan. Renata Cross moved back to Ohio. I thought about Damien more than I expected to in the weeks after the resolution. Not with sympathy, exactly, though occasionally something close to it surfaced. The recognition that a person who constructs an entire identity from borrowed material is operating from a kind of interior poverty that no amount of external success was ever going to fix. More with a kind of tired pragmatism. He had used people because he had never learned, or never been required, to become someone who didn't need to. That's not an excuse, but it's a thing. What I thought about more than Damien in those quiet weeks was Carolyn Voss. I called her again in January after the proceedings concluded. She deserved to know it was over. She deserved to hear from someone other than her own thoughts, that what had happened to her had been real, had been documented, and had been part of a pattern that was now a matter of record. She was quiet for a long time when I told her. "Is she okay?" Carolyn asked finally, meaning Lillian. "She's working on it," I said. "Good." Another pause. I spent a year thinking I'd done something wrong, that I'd missed something obvious that any reasonable person would have seen. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the effort in it. It's strange to hear that someone with your background, with everything you know, still had to work for 6 months to build a case against him. "He was good at it," I said. "He was." A pause. "That doesn't make it better, but it does make me feel less stupid." "You were never stupid," I said. "You were trusting. Those aren't the same thing, and he specifically targeted the people who were. That's not a character flaw in you. That's a method in him." She didn't say anything for a moment. "Thank you for calling me," she said finally. "You didn't have to." "I know," I said. After I hung up, I sat for a while with the phone in my hand. I thought about all the Carolyn Vosses who never got a call like that, who spent years with the unresolved weight of an experience that nobody officially acknowledged, who adjusted their understanding of themselves based on what a dishonest person had needed them to believe. There are more of them than anyone wants to count. That thought sat with me for a long time. It was Lillian who, in early February, did the thing I had not expected and was not prepared for. She came to my house on a Tuesday evening, her usual time, though by February the visits had become less frequent, which I took as a good sign. She was rebuilding her own life in her own space rather than spending every evening in mine. She came in, sat down, accepted the coffee I put in front of her, and said without preamble, "I want you to teach me." I looked at her. "What you know," she said, "about financial structures, about how to read a person's business claims, about all of it, the things you knew to look for that I didn't." She wrapped her hands around the mug. "I've been thinking about it for weeks, and I keep coming back to the same thing. I'm 27 years old, and I had $4 million coming to me in a year, and I didn't know the first thing about how to protect it. I didn't even understand the basic mechanics of what he was trying to do until you put documents in front of me." "That's not a failure of intelligence," I said. "No," she said. "It's a failure of preparation, and those are different things, like you said about Carolyn." She met my eyes. "I don't want to go through life trusting that other people will protect what I have. I want to know how to protect it myself." I looked at her for a long moment. The blue curtains in her childhood room. The girl who fell asleep on my shoulder during thunderstorms. The woman sitting across from me now, with the particular steady look of someone who has been through something bad, and has decided, without drama, to become different because of it. That, I said, is the best question you have ever asked me. She almost smiled. Not quite. She wasn't at almost smiling without effort yet, but close. You'll teach me? I'll teach you everything I know, I said. It'll take a while. I've got time, she said. Outside it was cold and gray, and the bare trees stood against a white sky, and the yard looked like it was waiting for something. Lillian drank her coffee, and I drank mine, and we sat there together in the kitchen where I'd started so many mornings, and for the first time in a very long time, the quiet felt like something other than wait. It felt like the beginning of something. What that something would become, I didn't fully know yet. None of us ever do when we're standing at that particular threshold. But I knew my granddaughter was on the other side of it, and I knew she was looking forward instead of back, and that was enough to work with. More than enough. The teaching started on a Wednesday morning in February at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and 2 cups of coffee, and Lillian showing up 7 minutes early because she'd always been punctual in the ways that mattered, even when she was careless in the ones that didn't. I hadn't prepared anything formal. I didn't have a curriculum or a syllabus or a plan beyond starting at the beginning and seeing how far we could get before the coffee ran out. That's how I learned most of what I know, not from a program or a course or someone handing me a structured path forward, but from sitting across from people who knew more than I did and paying very close attention to everything they said and everything they didn't say. I intended to give Lillian the same thing. All right, she said, settling into the chair across from me with the legal pad open and a pen in her hand, looking like a student who had decided to take the class seriously after previously coasting. Start wherever you think I need to start. Tell me what you know about how a trust works, I said. Your trust specifically, what you understand about the structure Martin set up. She told me. It took about 4 minutes and contained 3 significant misunderstandings and 2 gaps large enough that a person with Damien's specific skills could have driven a car through them. I let her finish before I said anything. Okay, I said. Here's where we begin. We spent 3 hours that first morning on the trust alone. Not on the emotional history of it, not on what it meant that Martin had established it, or what he'd been thinking about when he structured it the way he did, or what it represented about his love for her. Those things were true and real and mattered, but they weren't what she needed right now. What she needed right now was to understand the legal mechanics of what she owned and what protected it, and under what circumstances those protections could be challenged, and how to make them stronger. By the time we stopped for lunch, she had filled 6 pages of the legal pad with notes in her small, slightly cramped handwriting, and the look on her face had shifted from student paying attention to something more engaged than that. The particular alertness of someone who is discovering that a subject they thought was dry is actually the map of a territory they've been living in without knowing how to read. Why didn't anyone explain this to me before? She said, not angrily, genuinely curious. Because most people assume that the people who need to understand these things will figure it out when the time comes, I said. And because the people who manage these structures professionally have a financial interest in clients who don't fully understand what they're holding. She looked at me. That's cynical. It's accurate, I said. Cynical and accurate are not the same thing, though they overlap more than optimists like to admit. She wrote something down. I didn't ask what. Those Wednesday mornings became a fixture. We didn't always stay on the legal pad topics. Sometimes the conversation pulled toward other things, toward the larger questions that the specific financial education was really a way of approaching sideways. The kinds of questions that don't have clean answers but that a person has to work through anyway, or they carry them around unexamined for decades and pay for it in ways they don't always connect to the original debt. One morning in March, about 6 weeks into our sessions, Lillian arrived and sat down and didn't open the legal pad and said, "Can I ask you something that's not about trust structures?" Of course. Did you ever do something like what Damien did? Not the fraud, I don't mean that. But did you ever, in business, in your career, did you ever use someone, leverage a relationship to get something you needed, treat a person more like a resource than a person? I looked at her for a moment. It was not the question I'd expected, and it was also, I realized, the question that had probably been building for several weeks, the one that had been sitting underneath the legal pad discussions the whole time. Yes, I said. She held my gaze. Tell me. So I told her. Not everything. There are things from 40 years of business that I have processed and filed away in the part of my personal history that doesn't require regular revisitation, but the relevant piece. There was a partnership early in my career with a woman named Helen Morrow who had capital I needed and connections I didn't have, and who I pursued with a specific strategic purpose while also genuinely liking her. The two things coexisted. I benefited from the relationship more than she did. I was honest in the legal sense. No fraud, no false promises. But I was not fully honest in the human sense, which is a different and more ambiguous category. Helen and I parted ways after 3 years, professionally, but not warmly. I've thought about her over the decades. I sent her a note once, in the 90s, that she didn't respond to. The difference between what I did and what Damien did, I said, when I'd finished telling Lillian, is real, but it's not as large as I'd like it to be. What Damien did crossed legal and moral lines I never crossed, but the underlying impulse, treating a person primarily as a means to an end, I know what that feels like from the inside. I'm not proud of knowing it. Lillian was quiet. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because you asked," I said. "And because I think you need to know that the woman who protected you is not a simple person. I have my own history of doing things that weren't right. I've made decisions that served me. I've protected myself at the cost of being fully honest." I paused. "I'm telling you because I don't want you to build your understanding of this situation on a version of me that's cleaner than the reality." That's exactly what Damien did. Built his identity on a version of himself that couldn't survive contact with the truth. I'd rather you know the complicated version of me and trust it than believe the simple version and be disappointed later. She looked at me for a long time after that. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window at the angle it reaches in March, low and a little thin, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly more honest than it usually does. "You know," she said finally, "most grandmothers would have just said, 'I've always done the right thing, sweetheart.' Most grandmothers didn't build an investment network in 1987, I said. She smiled. A real one. The first fully unguarded smile I'd seen from her since before the wedding, and it landed somewhere in the middle of my chest with a weight I hadn't expected. Spring came the way it always does in this part of the country. Reluctantly, in fits and starts, a warm week followed by a cold snap, followed by 3 days of rain that made you question whether the season was actually going to show up or had simply decided to skip this year. By April, the trees in my yard were doing what they do, and I had started spending mornings on the back porch with my coffee the way I do when the weather allows. And Lillian had started joining me sometimes, sitting in the other chair with her own coffee and her legal pad, which had by now been replaced by a proper notebook she'd bought herself. She was also, by April, doing something I hadn't suggested and hadn't anticipated. She had started asking to sit in on calls. Not my personal calls. She wasn't asking to intrude on anything private. But the regular conversations I have with David Parrish, with Sue Jin, with the various professionals I work with to manage the investments I still maintain. She would sit off to the side, not speaking, just listening. Afterward, she would ask questions, specific ones, the kind that demonstrated she'd been paying attention to things most people would have let slide past. David noticed. He called me after the third time. "Your granddaughter asked me to explain the difference between a revocable and irrevocable trust in terms of creditor protection," he said. Then she asked a follow-up question that most attorneys take 3 years to think to ask. "What was the question?" He told me. He was right. It was a good question. Better than good. "She's a quick study," I said. "She's more than that," David said. "Evelyn, has she thought about what she wants to do? Professionally, I mean, long term." "She has a job," I said. Lillian had been working in marketing for a mid-sized company for 2 years. Good work, competent work, work she was good at without being particularly lit up by it. "I know she has a job," David said. "That's not what I asked." I thought about that conversation for a few days afterward. I didn't bring it up with Lillian directly. She would get there herself or she wouldn't, and pushing before she was ready would accomplish nothing except making her feel pressured in a season when she'd already had enough of being steered. But I watched, over the following weeks, the way her attention sharpened when we talked about the things that mattered to me professionally. The way she started bringing her own research to our Wednesday mornings. Articles she'd read, questions she'd developed outside of our sessions, observations about things she'd noticed in the financial news that connected to principles we'd discussed. She was not studying because I'd asked her to. She was studying because she'd found something that made her want to. That distinction matters more than most people realize. All the talent in the world doesn't develop into anything durable without the internal pull that makes a person keep going when the external pressure is removed. Lillian had that pull. She'd always had it. I'd seen it in her as a child, in the focused intensity she brought to the things that genuinely interested her, the way it dropped off completely for the things that didn't. The question had always been whether she'd find the domain that deserved that intensity. It appeared she had found it. In May, she told me she was thinking about going back to school. Not for a traditional degree, she had one of those already, in communications, from a good university. What she was thinking about was a certification program in financial planning, a 2-year part-time program she could complete while keeping her current job, offered through the business school at a university 40 minutes from where she lived. She brought me the program materials on a Wednesday morning and laid them out on the table between us without saying anything, the way people present things when they want your honest response but are slightly afraid of it. I read through what she'd brought. The curriculum was solid, the certification was respected in the industry. The time commitment was real but manageable for someone with her discipline. The faculty included 2 people whose names I recognized and whose work I thought well of. "What do you think?" she said. "I think you should do it," I said. She let out a breath that told me she'd been holding it without fully realizing. "You're not going to tell me to think about it more? Take my time? Make sure I'm not making a reactive decision because of everything that happened?" "Are you?" I said. "Making a reactive decision?" She thought about it honestly, which I appreciated. She didn't just say no immediately to reassure me. She actually sat with the question. "I don't think so," she said. "I think what happened with Damien exposed something I'd been ignoring about myself, about what I was interested in and what I was just doing because it seemed like a reasonable path." She looked down at the program materials and then back up at me. "I was never lit up by marketing. I was competent, but I'm lit up by this. I noticed that I'm lit up by it. And I don't think that's just a reaction to the crisis. I think the crisis just made me stop ignoring it." That was one of the most self-aware things I had ever heard her say, and I told her so. She enrolled in June. The thing I have not yet told you, the thing I have been approaching from the sides for most of this account, is what happened with me during those months. Not with Damien, not with the legal proceedings, not with Lillian's education. With me. I am not by nature a person who examines her own interior landscape with great regularity. I find introspection useful in the way I find most tools useful, as a means to an end, not as an end in itself. I process what needs to be processed, and I move forward, which has served me well in most circumstances, and has occasionally served me badly in the specific circumstances that require sitting still with something rather than moving through it. Yet what the year of Damien Cross required me to sit still with was this. I had spent 30 years building something significant, and I had spent almost all of those years building it quietly. Not secretly. Nothing I did was hidden in any improper way, but privately. Deliberately out of sight. I had chosen, for reasons that made sense to me and that I still mostly stand by, to live in a way that didn't broadcast what I had. And I had told myself for a long time that this was a principled choice, that I valued privacy, that I didn't need external validation, that the coat and the worn shoes were a statement about what actually matters. All of that was true. It was also, I admitted to myself that spring, a form of armor. If you don't show people what you have, they can't want it from you. If you don't advertise your worth, you don't have to manage the relationships that form around your worth rather than around you. If you live quietly in the old coat, the people who sit down across from you at a kitchen table are there because they want to be there, not because they've calculated what proximity to you might yield. Martin had understood this about me. He never pushed me toward a different way of being. He would tease me about the coat, but he knew exactly why I wore it, and he wore his own version of it, and we had built something real together, partly because we were both, at our cores, people who didn't need the audience. What I had not accounted for, what the year of Damien Cross forced me to account for, was Lillian. I had protected my privacy so thoroughly that my own granddaughter had walked into a marriage with a fraud and thought she was doing it without the safety net of my knowledge and my resources. She had not known to come to me, not fully, not in the way that might have changed things earlier, because I had spent her entire life being the grandmother in the old coat rather than the grandmother who could tell her, "I see more than you think I see, and I know more than you think I know, and when you need protection, I am capable of providing it. She had loved me. She had known I loved her. But she had not known, not really, not in a way she could access when it mattered, what I was actually capable of. That was my failure. Not the coat, not the privacy, not the quiet life, but the specific failure to make sure this person I loved most knew what was available to her. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about it on the back porch in April and on the drive to David's office in January, and in the kitchen at 2 in the morning when Damien's call woke me up, and in a dozen other quiet moments spread across the months. I never fully resolved it. I don't think failures of that particular kind resolve. I think they become part of the understanding you carry forward, part of what shapes the choices you make differently next time. What I resolved was this. The privacy was mine to keep. The knowledge of what I could do for the people I loved, that I would give more freely. Those are not the same thing, and I had been conflating them for too long. By summer, Lillian and I had developed something that I'm not sure has a clean name. It wasn't teacher and student anymore, not exactly. The dynamic had shifted into something more lateral, more collaborative. She would bring things to our sessions that I hadn't thought of, angles I hadn't considered, questions that sent me back to my own files to check assumptions I'd been carrying for years without revisiting. She was younger, and she was faster with certain things, and she had no ego about the gaps in what she knew, which meant she learned without the defensive slowing down that ego produces. I had the years and the pattern recognition and the particular hard-won knowledge that only comes from having made decisions with real stakes attached and lived with the outcomes. She had the energy and the specific hunger that comes from someone who has been shaken awake to what they're actually capable of. Together, that was something. Victor Ashford had lunch with me in July. We have lunch 2 or 3 times a year, always at the same restaurant, always at the same corner table, always the same order for both of us because neither of us sees any reason to change something that works. He asked about Lillian. I told him where things stood. He was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee. You should bring her to the Meridian Portfolio Review, he said. Meridian was a quarterly meeting of a small group of private investors, people Victor and I had both been connected to for years. The kind of gathering that doesn't have a website or a formal structure, but that has shaped more than a few significant decisions in the financial landscape of this region. It was not the kind of meeting you brought people to casually. It was the kind of meeting you brought people to when you were vouching for them. She's only been studying for a few months, I said. I know that, Victor said. I'm not suggesting she present anything. I'm suggesting she sit in the room. He looked at me with the particular steady directness he has. You know what it meant for you the first time someone brought you into a room like that. I did know. I still know. The first time I sat in a room where people with real knowledge and real resources were talking seriously about real things, something shifted in me that couldn't shift back. It wasn't about the specific information. It was about understanding, for the first time at a cellular level, that I belonged in that conversation, that the conversation could include me, that there was a seat at the table that was actually mine if I was willing to do the work to hold it. I wanted that for Lillian. I'll ask her, I said. She said yes before I finished the sentence. The Meridian meeting was in August. I won't describe the details of it. That's not mine to share, and Lillian's story in that room is hers to tell in whatever form she eventually tells it. What I can tell you is what I saw. I saw my granddaughter walk into a room full of people who had been in that room for years, and I saw her sit down without any of the particular performance that young people sometimes put on when they're trying to prove they belong somewhere. She didn't try to impress anyone. She listened. She asked one question, one, carefully chosen, at exactly the right moment, that made 2 of the people at the table look at her with the specific attention that means I want to know more about you. On the drive home, she was quiet for a long time. Well, I said. I want that, she said. Not elaborately, not with the breathless excitement of someone who's been starstruck, with the quiet certainty of someone who has recognized something. I know, I said. How long did it take you? Before you were actually in the room, not just sitting in it. Years, I said. But you're starting earlier than I did, and you have something I didn't. What? I kept my eyes on the road. Someone who already knows what's in the room and can tell you what you're looking at. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, Grammy. I'm sorry I didn't come to you before the wedding, when I first started having those feelings. The ones I didn't know how to name. I should have called you. I think I knew somewhere that you'd see what I was missing, and I didn't call because—" She stopped. "Because you were afraid I'd be right," I said. "Yes." "I know," I said. "I was afraid of the same thing, from the other side." We drove in silence for a few minutes, the summer evening coming through the windows, the kind of light that makes the ordinary landscape look briefly like something worth preserving. "I'm not sorry it happened," Lillian said. "I know that sounds strange, but I'm not. I learned things I needed to learn, about myself, about what I was ignoring, about what I actually want." A pause. "I wouldn't have chosen for it to happen the way it did, but I'm not sorry for where it's brought me." I thought about that for the rest of the drive home. I want to tell you what I've learned. Not as a lesson delivered from above. I have never had much patience for that posture, the person on the elevation announcing wisdom down to the crowd below. More is what it actually is. The specific understanding of one woman built up over decades of difficult experience that I'm passing along because someone passed things along to me once, and it mattered more than I told them at the time. The first thing is this. What you have is not the same as what you are. Damien Cross had nothing and built an elaborate structure of performance to make people believe he had everything. His whole identity was constructed from borrowed material, borrowed money, borrowed credibility, borrowed time. And when all of that was taken away, there was nothing underneath it. Not nothing as in not much, nothing as in the specific terrifying vacancy of a person who has spent so long performing a self that they have no clear sense of what they actually are beneath the performance. I have worn the same coat for 20 years. Not because I'm poor and not because I'm performing poverty and not because I don't understand that appearances matter in certain contexts. Because what I am is not located in what I wear, and I have always needed to know the difference between those two things with complete clarity. When you know that, when you really know it, not as a philosophy but as a lived daily practice, nobody can use the gap against you. Nobody can make you feel like less by pointing at your shoes, because your shoes and your worth are not connected in any way that matters. The second thing, protection is not the same as control, but they are close enough neighbors that you have to watch the line carefully. I protected Lillian, I'm sure of that, but I also, in protecting her, made choices that weren't entirely about her, choices that were about managing my own fear, my own need to be the one holding the truth, rather than sharing it in the messy, risky, real way that genuine intimacy requires. The protection was real. The control was real too. Holding both of those things at the same time, without letting one cancel out the other, is the kind of honesty that takes practice. I am still practicing. The third thing, and this one I say not as wisdom, but as something closer to a wound that is healed imperfectly and that I have learned to live with. The people who use love as currency, who trade in warmth and intimacy and the feeling of being seen, not because they feel those things, but because they've learned those things, get them what they need. Those people are not simply bad. They are people who are taught, by someone or by circumstance, that love is something you earn through performance rather than something you give without condition. That doesn't excuse what they do. The harm they cause is real. Carolyn Voss is real. Lillian's year of grief is real. The people whose money Damien took under false pretenses are real. None of that is erased by understanding where he came from. But I think about who Damien Cross might have been if someone, early, had taught him what I'm trying now to teach Lillian. That the point is not to construct something impressive enough that people will give you what you need. The point is to build something real enough that you don't need them to. I don't say that with sentimentality. I say it with the specific pragmatism of someone who has watched what happens to people who never learn it. The fourth thing, the last one, and the one that is perhaps the most personal, is this. It is never too late to be recognized. I spent 30 years being the woman in the room that people looked past. I chose that. I don't regret it. But I also want to say clearly to anyone who is sitting in a room right now and being looked past, being assessed by their shoes or their coat or their age or the absence of obvious markers of what they're worth, that the looking past says nothing about you and everything about the person doing it. Victor stood up in that ballroom not to rescue me. I didn't need rescuing. He stood up because a man was using a public room to diminish someone who deserved better. And Victor is the kind of person who understands that silence in those moments is a choice with consequences. I am grateful to him. But the truth, he said, the truth about who I am and what I've built, that truth existed before he said it. It existed in that room the entire time. It was always there. The people who couldn't see it were not seeing something that wasn't there. They were revealing something about their own vision. Never confuse those two things. It is October now. A year and some months since the wedding at the Ashford Grand, since the morning I woke at 5 o'clock with a low, unnamed unease in my chest, and put on my old coat and drove out to watch my granddaughter marry a man I already knew was not what he appeared to be. The coat has a new button. Lillian sewed it on in September, on a Sunday afternoon when she was at my house, and noticed the gap and disappeared for 20 minutes and came back with a needle and thread she'd found in my sewing basket and fixed it without being asked and without making a thing of it. The button doesn't quite match the others, slightly darker, slightly different material, but it works. And I've decided I like the mismatch. It looks like something that has been repaired rather than replaced, which seems honest. Lillian is 6 months into her certification program. She is, according to the instructor she mentioned in passing last week, one of the 2 strongest students in the cohort, which she said not with pride, but with the quiet assessment of someone noting a fact. She has started developing her own understanding of certain structures in ways that have moved beyond what I originally taught her, and into territory I find genuinely interesting to discuss. 2 weeks ago, she challenged something I said about a particular instrument's risk profile, and she was right. I told her so. She wrote it down, which I found both slightly funny and quietly moving. She has not dated anyone. I have not mentioned this. It is not my business, and it is not my timeline. When she is ready for whatever comes next in that part of her life, she will be ready, and she will bring to it a clearer sense of what she needs and what she will not accept, and what love is supposed to actually feel like when it isn't a performance. I trust that. I trust her. Robert and Patricia have settled into something more honest than they had before. Patricia told me in September that she had started paying more attention to things she used to let slide past. Financial things, contractual things, the fine print of their lives that she'd always assumed Robert was handling. Robert, for his part, seemed not threatened by this, but relieved. That surprised me, and then it didn't. Most people don't actually want to carry everything alone. They do it because nobody offered to share the weight. Victor and I had our corner table lunch last month. He told me that 2 of the people from the Meridian meeting had asked about Lillian. He mentioned their names. I recognized them. I told him to pass along my contact information and let them reach out directly. He said he already had. Carolyn Voss sent me a card in the spring. I don't know how she got my address. I have my theories. And the card said almost nothing, just a few lines, but she signed her full name and included her phone number. And I called her and we talked for 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with Damien Cross. She's a veterinarian, it turns out. She has 3 dogs. She is building something real, in her own way, in her own time, in a life that belongs to her. As for Damien himself, I have thought about him less as the year has progressed, which I think is probably healthy. He is somewhere in this city or he isn't. He is rebuilding something or he's not. He will make better choices or he won't. That is not my weight to carry. I set it down when I handed the documents to David Parrish, and I have not picked it up again. What I carry instead is lighter and more sustainable. The Tuesday phone calls from Lillian, which have gotten longer and more substantive as the months have passed. The Wednesday mornings that have evolved from formal sessions into something more like the ongoing conversation between 2 people who are genuinely interested in what the other thinks. The particular pleasure of watching someone who is mine, my blood, my history, the child of the child I raised, discover what she is actually made of, in real time, without pretense. I wake at 5 o'clock. I make coffee. I sit at the kitchen table. The house settles around me the way it always has. The yard outside the window moves through its seasons. The coat hangs by the door with its mismatched button. I am 72 years old, and I have built things that will outlast me, and I have made mistakes that I carry without drama, and I have loved people imperfectly and well, and I have sat in rooms where I was invisible and held everything I needed without needing anyone to see it. And I have learned, I am still learning, that this is enough, that it has always been enough, that the woman who sits quietly in the corner, watching, waiting, building something true, inside a life that doesn't ask for applause, that woman is not waiting to be discovered. She already knows what she is. She always did. And if you are sitting somewhere right now feeling looked past, feeling diminished, feeling like the room has decided what you're worth before you've had the chance to show them, I want you to hear this clearly and without comfort that costs nothing. They are wrong about you. Not because the world is fair, not because good things always come to people who deserve them, but because what you carry inside yourself, the real thing, the built thing, the thing you know about yourself at 5 in the morning when nobody is watching, that is not subject to their assessment. They can look at your coat. They cannot see what's underneath it. That is your advantage. Use it wisely. That was my failure. Not the coat, not the privacy, not the quiet life, but the specific failure to make sure the person I loved most knew what was available to her. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about it on the back porch in April, and on the drive to David's office in January, and in the kitchen at 2 in the morning when Damien's call woke me up, and in a dozen other quiet moments spread across the months. I never fully resolved it. I don't think failures of that particular kind resolve. I think they become part of the understanding you carry forward, part of what shapes the choices you make differently next time. What I resolved was this: the privacy was mine to keep. The knowledge of what I could do for the people I loved, that I would give more freely. Those are not the same thing, and I had been conflating them for too long. By summer, Lillian and I had developed something that I'm not sure has a clean name. It wasn't teacher and student anymore, not exactly. The dynamic had shifted into something more lateral, more collaborative. She would bring things to our sessions that I hadn't thought of, angles I hadn't considered, questions that sent me back to my own files to check assumptions I'd been carrying for years without revisiting. She was younger and she was faster with certain things, and she had no ego about the gaps in what she knew, which meant she learned without the defensive slowing down that ego produces. I had the years and the pattern recognition and the particular hard-won knowledge that only comes from having made decisions with real stakes attached and lived with the outcomes. She had the energy and the specific hunger that comes from someone who has been shaken awake to what they're actually capable of. Together, that was something. Victor Ashford had lunch with me in July. We have lunch 2 or 3 times a year, always at the same restaurant, always at the same corner table, always the same order for both of us because neither of us sees any reason to change something that works. He asked about Lillian. I told him where things stood. He was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee. You should bring her to the Meridian Portfolio Review, he said. Meridian was a quarterly meeting of a small group of private investors, people Victor and I had both been connected to for years. The kind of gathering that doesn't have a website or a formal structure, but that has shaped more than a few significant decisions in the financial landscape of this region. It was not the kind of meeting you brought people to casually. It was the kind of meeting you brought people to when you were vouching for them. She's only been studying for a few months, I said. I know that, Victor said. I'm not suggesting she present anything. I'm suggesting she sit in the room. He looked at me with the particular steady directness he has. You know what it meant for you the first time someone brought you into a room like that. I did know. I still know. The first time I sat in a room where people with real knowledge and real resources were talking seriously about real things, something shifted in me that couldn't shift back. It wasn't about the specific information. It was about understanding, for the first time at a cellular level, that I belonged in that conversation, that the conversation could include me, that there was a seat at the table that was actually mine if I was willing to do the work to hold it. I wanted that for Lillian. I'll ask her, I said. She said yes before I finished the sentence. The Meridian meeting was in August. I won't describe the details of it. That's not mine to share, and Lillian's story in that room is hers to tell in whatever form she eventually tells it. What I can tell you is what I saw. I saw my granddaughter walk into a room full of people who had been in that room for years, and I saw her sit down without any of the particular performance that young people sometimes put on when they're trying to prove they belong somewhere. She didn't try to impress anyone. She listened. She asked one question, one, carefully chosen, at exactly the right moment, that made 2 of the people at the table look at her with the specific attention that means, I want to know more about you. On the drive home, she was quiet for a long time. Well, I said. I want that, she said. Not elaborately, not with the breathless excitement of someone who's been starstruck, with the quiet certainty of someone who has recognized something. "I know," I said. "How long did it take you, before you were actually in the room, not just sitting in it?" "Years," I said. "But you're starting earlier than I did, and you have something I didn't." "What?" "I kept my eyes on the road. Someone who already knows what's in the room and can tell you what you're looking at." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Grammy." "I'm sorry I didn't come to you before the wedding, when I first started having those feelings, the ones I didn't know how to name. I should have called you. I think I knew somewhere that you'd see what I was missing, and I didn't call because—" She stopped. "Because you were afraid I'd be right," I said. "Yes." "I know." "No," I said. "I was afraid of the same thing, from the other side." We drove in silence for a few minutes, the summer evening coming through the windows, the kind of light that makes the ordinary landscape look briefly like something worth preserving. "I'm not sorry it happened," Lillian said. "I know that sounds strange, but I'm not. I learned things I needed to learn. About myself. About what I was ignoring. About what I actually want." A pause. "I wouldn't have chosen for it to happen the way it did, but I'm not sorry for where it's brought me." I thought about that for the rest of the drive home. But I want to tell you what I've learned. Not as a lesson delivered from above. I have never had much patience for that posture, the person on the elevation announcing wisdom down to the crowd below. More is what it actually is. The specific understanding of one woman, built up over decades of difficult experience, that I'm passing along because someone passed things along to me once, and it mattered more than I told them at the time. The first thing is this. What you have is not the same as what you are. Damien Cross had nothing and built an elaborate structure of performance to make people believe he had everything. His whole identity was constructed from borrowed material, borrowed money, borrowed credibility, borrowed time. And when all of that was taken away, there was nothing underneath it. Not nothing as in not much, nothing as in the specific terrifying vacancy of a person who has spent so long performing a self that they have no clear sense of what they actually are beneath the performance. I have worn the same coat for 20 years, not because I'm poor and not because I'm performing poverty and not because I don't understand that appearances matter in certain contexts. Because what I am is not located in what I wear, and I have always needed to know the difference between those two things with complete clarity. When you know that, when you really know it, not as a philosophy but as a lived daily practice, nobody can use the gap against you. Nobody can make you feel like less by pointing at your shoes, because your shoes and your worth are not connected in any way that matters. The second thing, protection is not the same as control, but they are close enough neighbors that you have to watch the line carefully. I protected Lillian, I'm sure of that. But I also, in protecting her, made choices that weren't entirely about her, choices that were about managing my own fear, my own need to be the one holding the truth, rather than sharing it in the messy, risky, real way that genuine intimacy requires. The protection was real. The control was real too. Holding both of those things at the same time, without letting one cancel out the other, is the kind of honesty that takes practice. I am still practicing. The third thing, and this one I say not as wisdom, but as something closer to a wound that is healed imperfectly and that I have learned to live with. The people who use love as currency, who trade in warmth and intimacy and the feeling of being seen, not because they feel those things, but because they've learned those things, get them what they need. Those people are not simply bad. They are people who are taught, by someone or by circumstance, that love is something you earn through performance rather than something you give without condition. That doesn't excuse what they do. The harm they cause is real. Carolyn Voss is real. Lillian's year of grief is real. The people whose money Damien took under false pretenses are real. None of that is erased by understanding where he came from, but I think about who Damien Cross might have been if someone, early, had taught him what I'm trying now to teach Lillian. That the point is not to construct something impressive enough that people will give you what you need. The point is to build something real enough that you don't need them to. I don't say that with sentimentality. I say it with the specific pragmatism of someone who has watched what happens to people who never learn it. The fourth thing, the last one, and the one that is perhaps the most personal, is this. It is never too late to be recognized. I spent 30 years being the woman in the room that people looked past. I chose that. I don't regret it. But I also want to say, clearly, To anyone who is sitting in a room right now and being looked past, being assessed by their shoes or their coat or their age or the absence of obvious markers of what they're worth, that the looking past says nothing about you and everything about the person doing it. Victor stood up in that ballroom not to rescue me. I didn't need rescuing. He stood up because a man was using a public room to diminish someone who deserved better. And Victor is the kind of person who understands that silence in those moments is a choice with consequences. I am grateful to him. But the truth he said, the truth about who I am and what I've built, that truth existed before he said it. It existed in that room the entire time. It was always there. The people who couldn't see it were not seeing something that wasn't there. They were revealing something about their own vision. Never confuse those two things. It is October now. A year and some months since the wedding at the Ashford Grand, since the morning I woke at 5 o'clock with a low unnamed unease in my chest and put on my old coat and drove out to watch my granddaughter marry a man I already knew was not what he appeared to be. The coat has a new button. Lillian sewed it on in September, on a Sunday afternoon when she was at my house, and noticed the gap and disappeared for 20 minutes, and came back with a needle and thread she'd found in my sewing basket and fixed it without being asked, and without making a thing of it. The button doesn't quite match the others, slightly darker, slightly different material, but it works, and I've decided I like the mismatch. It looks like something that has been repaired rather than replaced, which seems honest. Lillian is 6 months into her certification program. She is, according to the instructor she mentioned in passing last week, one of the 2 strongest students in the cohort, which she said not with pride, but with the quiet assessment of someone noting a fact. She has started developing her own understanding of certain structures in ways that have moved beyond what I originally taught her, and into territory I find genuinely interesting to discuss. 2 weeks ago, she challenged something I said about a particular instrument's risk profile, and she was right. I told her so. She wrote it down, which I found both slightly funny and quietly moving. She has not dated anyone. I have not mentioned this. It is not my business, and it is not my timeline. When she is ready for whatever comes next in that part of her life, she will be ready, and she will bring to it a clearer sense of what she needs and what she will not accept, and what love is supposed to actually feel like when it isn't a performance. I trust that. I trust her. Robert and Patricia have settled into something more honest than they had before. Patricia told me in September that she had started paying more attention to things she used to let slide past, financial things, contractual things, the fine print of their lives that she'd always assumed Robert was handling. Robert, for his part, seemed not threatened by this, but relieved. That surprised me, and then it didn't. Most people don't actually want to carry everything alone. They do it because nobody offered to share the weight. Victor and I had our corner table lunch last month. He told me that 2 of the people from the Meridian meeting had asked about Lillian. He mentioned their names. I recognized them. I told him to pass along my contact information and let them reach out directly. He said he already had. Carolyn Voss sent me a card in the spring. I don't know how she got my address. I have my theories. And the card said almost nothing, just a few lines, but she signed her full name and included her phone number, and I called her and we talked for 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with Damien Cross. She's a veterinarian, it turns out. She has 3 dogs. She is building something real, in her own way, in her own time, in a life that belongs to her. As for Damien himself, I have thought about him less as the year has progressed, which I think is probably healthy. He is somewhere in this city or he isn't. He is rebuilding something or he's not. He will make better choices or he won't. That is not my weight to carry. I set it down when I handed the documents to David Parrish, and I have not picked it up again. What I carry instead is lighter and more sustainable. The Tuesday phone calls from Lillian, which have gotten longer and more substantive as the months have passed. The Wednesday mornings that have evolved from formal sessions into something more like the ongoing conversation between 2 people who are genuinely interested in what the other thinks. The particular pleasure of watching someone who is mine, my blood, my history, the child of the child I raised, discover what she is actually made of, in real time, without pretense. I wake at 5 o'clock. I make coffee. I sit at the kitchen table. The house settles around me the way it always has. The yard outside the window moves through its seasons. The coat hangs by the door with its mismatched button. I am 72 years old, and I have built things that will outlast me, and I have made mistakes that I carry without drama, and I have loved people imperfectly and well, and I have sat in rooms where I was invisible and held everything I needed without needing anyone to see it. And I have learned, I am still learning, that this is enough, that it has always been enough, that the woman who sits quietly in the corner, watching, waiting, building something true inside a life that doesn't ask for applause, that woman is not waiting to be discovered. She already knows what she is. She always did. And if you are sitting somewhere right now feeling looked past, feeling diminished, feeling like the room has decided what you're worth before you've had the chance to show them, I want you to hear this clearly and without comfort that costs nothing. They are wrong about you. Not because the world is fair, not because good things always come to people who deserve them, but because what you carry inside yourself, the real thing, the built thing, the thing you know about yourself at 5 in the morning when nobody is watching, that is not subject to their assessment. They can look at your coat. They cannot see what's underneath it. That is your advantage.